Yeah, to bring the people back, no? Okay, we're going live now. Yeah, great. ¿Qué dices? Okay, and we're gonna just wait. I think that Pilar went to get some people in the at Meli downstairs. Hi, welcome. Hi. So in the meantime that people are coming up and connecting, just so that in the interest of time, I'm gonna do a repeat of the original introduction, just for those that are new to the auditorium right now. Yeah. And to the connection. Okay, so this is something that others have heard already, but welcome, hi and welcome to Kunstinstitut Meli's International Conference, Effective Graphic Design. We are holding this conference on site at our institution in Rotterdam, and we're also live streaming it online at kunstmeli.nl and also in the YouTube channel of our presenting partner, the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht. My name is Sofia Hernandez Chancuy, and I'm the director here at Kunstinstitut Meli. So again, for those that weren't here in the first keynote, I'll just mention very briefly that the idea of this conference, Effective Graphic Design, emerged just after we had launched our new visual identity for Kunstinstitut Meli, which was earlier this year. And it was really an amazing experience of working with 6 graphic design students at Work Plus Typography, and in partnership with us, and also workshops, a design studio based in Berlin and New York, that we learned so much about not only how to make a visual identity and what we wanted to communicate and how, but specifically of an interest in general in graphic design. And a lot of questions were left there that we wanted to continue to explore them. And so here we are. Just so you know, the graphic designers, or a number of them that created our design, will be here in a panel tomorrow at 5 p.m. As part of the conference. The conference keynotes, as the one that we're going to be just listening with Cuauhtémoc Medina, they focus on influential thinkers that have been both relevant for the developments of art history and graphic design. However, they are little known outside of their original context. And the panel discussions are discussions that or themes that are discussed widely in different social circles of professionals and peers. But again, this time we're bringing them to a public event so they could also be addressed by a larger audience. I want to thank Yingying Wong for being one of the motivators and organizers of this conference, and she will be moderating a couple of panels. I also want to acknowledge the importance that Prem Krishnamurthy's ideas, as well as Thomas Castro's, had in shaping this conference. And finally, I want to take this opportunity to thank Pilar Matatu Pont for her extraordinary work in organizing the conference, as well as to Jeroen Lavin, who's here in the back of the screens. He will be moderating also a panel tomorrow. Thanks to Lynn Kramer, Angelique Kool, Paul Van Hennep, Julia Moshuka, and Gabi Dow, as well as to Wusuk Yang, who designed the typography for today's graphic design conference. So now we're going to move on to introduce. We come from a coffee break after having heard Irene Small speak very beautifully about tracing the organic line, not only the work of Ligia Clark in relationship to Malevich, but to think about it as a tool to understand our contemporaneity and read modernism from, for example, a level of composition and subjectivity. And now we turned to our second keynote of the conference, Cuauhtémoc Medina, who's a critic, a curator, and an art historian from the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas at UNAM, the National University in Mexico City. And he is also someone that is connected to our Netherlands for a very beautiful reason, which is that he was a resident in 1999 at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht. And as you know, the Jan van Eyck is one of our partnering presenting institutions here. Cuauhtémoc is the chief curator also of MUAC, the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo, which is within the university. And it's at this museum that in 2015, there was an exhibition retrospective of visual artist and graphic designer Vicente Rojo, who actually passed away in March of this year. So just very recently, almost at 90 years of age. Vicente Rojo is the focus of Cuauhtémoc's lecture today. Thank you so much, Cuauhtémoc, for participating, and we give you the floor to begin.
On the contrary, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak in this conference, but above all because the recent passing of Vicente Rojo makes it something of a personal obligation. So I'm going to actually start by sharing the screen, and I hope this works properly. Are you seeing only one image or two, Sophia? Is it properly shared?
It's properly shown, correct.
Okay. So, as Sophia told you, on March 17 this year, painter, graphic designer, sculptor, and editor Vicente Rojo died in Mexico City. Vicente's death came to occupy a significant place in the covers of Mexican main newspapers, well across the ideological divide, and in terms that somehow presumed the readers were more or less familiar with his name and reputation. In the midst of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, his death from heart failure became a landmark of the passing of an era. The words that writer Jorge Volpi used to tweet his condolences are symptomatic of the stature of Rojo in Mexican modern culture. And I'm going to translate. Great loss, that of Vicente Rojo, the inescapable artist of modern Mexico, generous designer, perpetual lover of books, accomplice of painters, sculptors, writers, and poets, and a serene man of integrity, end of quote. Let me linger for a second in part of Volpi's description. There is an unconscious cunning twist in saying that an artist is unavoidable. The hyperbole, however, in this case, is quite fitting. For producers of and consumers of Mexican culture, Rojo's hands are practically everywhere. But besides that, his work and memory represents, from the local enlightened classes, something of an ethical example. His legacy is not particularly comprised in the production of arguments or theories, least on any political or military deed. It comes from a daily constant practice. More or less unconsciously, but almost without exception, Mexican cultural consumers between 1955 and say 2000 will grew in a visual and semiotic world heavily reliant on Vicente Rojo's graphic design. It is impossible to quantify it, but I presume that a third, at least, of the books, magazines, and ephemera I had access as a youngster in the 1970s and 80s were composed by Rojo's hands. His relevance in the previous decades was almost monopolistic. Even today, left-wing readers are subjected to their daily dose of news and prejudices from the tabloid that Rojo designed in 1984, La Jornada. If there's a period style of so-called desarrollismo, developmentalism, that shows the confidence of national modern culture in an era of economic and political stability, and a certain confidence from the left on the possibilities of social progress, is because Vicente Rojo's design came to incarnate the construction of the Mexican cultural canon and the emergence of the new left. Surely, and here you see him working with writer Juan Rulfo, no other than Rulfo. Surely, his omnipresence was helped by his remarkable work ethic. Differently from most of his contemporaries, Rojo was a teetotaler and not fond of partying late. In a time of individual experimentation and hedonism, he was amongst the sober workaholics that kept the circus running so the rest could make their acrobacies. 2. Apprentice as reinvention. Rojo was born in Barcelona in 1932 in a particularly fateful moment. His first memories were witnessing from his window when he was 4 years old, the chaotic but festive mobilization of trucks in the Paseo de San Juan in Barcelona, carrying weapons and flags, vowing to defeat Franco's uprising against the Second Republic. The Spanish Civil War and then the Republican exile deeply marked his life, even in relation to his name. Vicente's uncle and namesake was one of the most important militaries that remained loyal to the Spanish Republic. General Rojo was one of the last Republican military men to cross the border when the freedom cause was lost, and then migrated to Argentina and Bolivia. In the meantime, his older brother, Engineer Francisco Rojo Luch, that militated in the Catalan Socialist Unified Party, PSU, and as an electrical mechanical engineer, was part of the leadership of the National Workers' Union, who both organizations connected to the Communist Party, by the way, fled to France, fearing retaliation from the victors, and applied to join the thousands of loyal Republicans who found refuge on the other side of on the other shore of the Atlantic, welcomed by leftist Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas. He left his family in Barcelona, and his son Vicente has described his early life in Spain as a living hell. He was stigmatized by the implications of his name and suffered the constant economic deprivation and harassment coming from the victory of fascism. He would describe with particular resentment that teachers used to tie his left hand, trying to force him to be right-handed. Rojo tended to escape reading literature and attending very bad lessons of drawing and clay sculpture. He had, quote, he said, an obsessive need to have paper, color pencils, scissors, and glue in his hands, end of quote. And even though he was very young, he started to imagine working as a painter and as a sculptor. A decade later, Francisco Rojo finally managed to have his child joining him in exile. Vicente always described his arrival to Mexico as an inner enlightenment, in very literal terms. Quote, light dazzled me, and such glare has accompanied me to date. In Mexico, I found freedom, or at least my freedom, end of quote. He was taken aback by Mexico's hospitality and history. There is a beautiful snapshot of him painting a corny a landscape of the Sun Pyramid in the ancient city of Teotihuacan that conveys his discovery of the new country as a spiritual renaissance. Of that image, Rojo once said, quote, "I started my cultural training as a young Mexican eager to learn," end of quote. However, his process of tropicalization was not the result of amateurism. It was a professional destination. For once, being an emigré was a major asset. A significant amount of the close to 25,000 Spanish Republican loyalists that landed in Mexico were almost immediately integrated into the fabric of their host country. The Spanish exile transformed in a few years the scope and quality of Mexican higher education and the local cultural production. In practice, they sublimated their revolutionary and utopian dreams into an extraordinary commitment to culture and education, a position that Vicente Rojo upheld all his life with absolute certainty, as this statement from 1978 attests, quote, "I belong to the group of those who transform reality, even if I'm part of the wing of the failed ones. In order to change the world or life, you need imagination or good marksmanship. Since I lack the latter, I have devoted myself to develop my imagination," end of quote. The Spanish loyalists were not alone in the drive to sublimate revolutionary instincts into the pursuit of high culture. In December 1946, modernizing President Miguel Alemán Valdés decreed the constitution of the most important cultural institution of Mexico, the Fine Arts and Literature Institute, INBA. Coinciding with a time of industrial and urban modernization, and led by the most important composer of the time, Carlos Chávez, INBA was inaugurated in 1948 to, quote, "cultivate, promote, and further the creation and research of fine arts," end of quote, including music, visual arts, theater, dance, literature, and architecture. Leading writers and intellectuals were brought to lead the different sections, particularly museum designer Fernando Gamboa and writer Salvador Novo, who mostly were in charge of the new institution, while Chávez kept on touring with his music around the world. The Fine Arts Palace, the opera house planned by the Ancien regime in the 1910s, but refurbished with revolutionary murals and the Maya revival style in its interior, became the emblem of a new deal between the artists and the revolution. The speech of President Alemán when candidate in 1945 was explicit on the commitment of his government with developing a certain logic of elitism. He said, quote, "The Institute will stimulate those who enjoy artistic genius," end of quote. Fernando Gamboa, head of the visual arts section, knew that unifying graphic design was key to producing the outlook of this new institution. In 1948, he hired another Spanish exile, Valencian painter Miguel Prieto, to establish an editorial technical office to centralize every printed matter related to INBA. Prieto was a committed communist realist painter that had taken part in the propaganda effort of the Second Spanish Republic, producing posters for organizations such as Socorro Rojo de España, Spanish Red Relief, along with a typographic arrangement of magazines such as Sur and the Mono Azul. Once established in Mexico City, Prieto became the most prominent graphic designer of the exiles. His modern and sober style became widely acclaimed because he produced one of the most famous books of that era, Pablo Neruda's 1950s edition of Canto General, with which inside covers painted by Diego Rivera and David Alfaro Siqueiros. As Rojo has written, Prieto imparted the printed matter of the Fine Arts Institute a sense of quality that he's called a visual democracy. Prieto valued in equal terms an art book and the ticket for a weekend concert. Early in 1949, another emigré, Federico Álvarez, told Vicente Rojo that Miguel Prieto was looking for an assistant. That was the way that Rojo joined the publication office with only 17 years old. He couldn't have been more fortunate. Prieto not only taught him how to achieve a very rigorous and beautiful sense of design with an extreme economy of means, but also introduced him to the maelstrom of the emerging cultural elite. Prieto had also been recruited by journalist and writer Fernando Benítez to launch what would become the most influential cultural supplement of all times, México en la Cultura, Mexico in Culture. Throughout the next 2 decades, Benítez supplements served as a virtual command deck of Mexican letters and arts, the place where new authors were released and ideas from north, south, east, and west were inoculated in the bloodstream of an emerging cultural audience. Despite his enormous coyness, Rojo learned how to mingle with the cream of the Mexican cultural world, which also integrated the stars of the Spanish exile. Alas, Prieto's mentorship was cut very short. 2 years into joining him in the Fine Arts Institute, Rojo found that his chief had to quit his post to devote his time to painting. His health was shaky, and in fact, he was to die in 1956. To his surprise, Vicente Rojo was then confirmed as head of the printing department by the new director of the Fine Arts Institute, Andrés Duarte. Quote, "I was 22 and beardless and callow, but I was able to grow a mustache to look a few months older," end of quote. A couple of years later, Duarte was sacked because he allowed the communist flag to be used in Frida Kahlo's funeral at the Fine Arts Palace, and Rojo lost his job. But then the cultural networks had grown and diversified, and Rojo was immediately called by the head of the National University's cultural section, which was in fact a second cultural ministry, to become the art director of the magazine of the university and to launch a pioneer art series with Paul Besheim's study on pre-Columbian sculpture, Pedro Rojas' monography on the Tonancintla masterful Indian Baroque chapel, and a book on 5 Mexican painters, including Frida Kahlo, Juan O'Gorman, and Julio Castellanos. Disenfranchised from his original post, Rojo soon helped to install a new Catalonian refugees venture, Imprenta Madero, a printing shop that belonged to Mr. Thomas Espresate. With Espresate's talent as entrepreneur and Rojo's design, Imprenta Madero became the printer of choice for all cultural publications in Mexico for at least 4 decades. From Imprenta Madero, Rojo kept on producing posters, magazines, and books for the different cultural official organizations and the emerging galleries and independent theaters, and of course, all the cultural programs of the National University. His quasi-monopoly on cultural printed matter in the 1950s and 1960s was attributed by one of his most closer associates, writer Carlos Monsiváis, as a result of his visual talent, but also to his unique understanding of how to lend cultural institutions an up-to-date appearance, a part of his ability to deliver in very tight deadlines. I'll quote here Monsiváis. Without having been the first or the only one to do it, Rojo moved the field of book and magazine production to a point of having an adequate aesthetic treatment, providing them with the formal requirements for their advancement. If Rojo concentrates so many activities, it is for a notorious motive. For a long time in Mexico, the average level of quality was not what it is today, nor was there an understanding of what was required in order to build a public for the cultural sector. One thinks only of Rojo when one desires modern levels of presentation. To the excess of demand of his services, frequently from one day to the other, Rojo answers overcoming complex technical difficulties without ever falling into self-indulgency. Without proclaiming it or hiding it, Rojo applies avant-garde procedures to graphic design. It's interesting this eulogy of the fact that he was avant-garde, but he didn't show it. He transcends the prettified state of good taste, bestowing concerts, exhibitions, and conferences with the status of spectacular deeds, and bringing visual culture up to date. End of quote. So Rojo's talent had to do with giving the aspirational values of Mexican modernism a graphic materialization, which became a guarantee of quality for the administrators. It's quite telling that when trying to explain Rojo's contribution, Monsiváis compared him with museographer Fernando Gamboa's role as some sort of cultural mandarin that organized the image of Mexican heritage through a number of exhibitions that exported the image of Mexico, the present and the past, on the two sides of the Iron Curtain. For Monsiváis, while Gamboa produced the public canon of major artists, Rojo, quote, organized for the cultural milieu the transition from the old to the new sensibility. He anticipates much of what is current today and is amongst one of the first that, from the field of publishing, works towards the democratization of culture, end of quote. So Rojo's role in contributing to the institutionalization of Mexican modern culture has also a lot to do with having joining forces with Mexican official Miguel Salas Ansúrez to create the most enduring magazine compiling Mexican culture, Artis de Mexico, founded in 1953 and still running today. Under Rojo's hands, Artis de Mexico created a model that compiled month after month study cases of Mexican art history, popular creativity, and modern art in a publication that constantly experimented with materials and forms in ways that were previously unheard in the Mexican milieu. He was quite confident in using a printing company that could offer both color offset and gravure with color layers and different papers and cutouts to produce instant coffee books that were accompanied strategically with translations in English and French. This is a completely new idea of what a publication from the South had to be, by the way. Besides, Rojo was key in establishing the language and ethos of almost all the magazines consumed by artists and intellectuals, from the university magazine to Revista de Bellas Artes, that gave an official seal of approval to new art and a new literature coming from the cosmopolitan cultural circuits emerging in the 50s. This was a space, indeed, of a new sensibility that was able to reconcile the new and the old, the local and the cosmopolitan without conflict. With time, Rojo produced some of the most important experiments on magazines of the modern period, like the covers of the groundbreaking Artes Visuales from the 1970s, published by the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, that, as you can see, including some really extraordinary conceptual proposals by Rojo. And then later on, the covers of the magazines edited by Octavio Paz, Plural and Vuelta in the 1970s. An undercover editor. Miguel Prieto, as we have seen, also bequeathed Rojo a key friend, writer and journalist Fernando Benítez, who, in Rojo's words, quote, became for almost 50 years my son, my brother, and my father, end of quote. When Rojo took over the role of artistic director of Mexico en la Cultura, he transformed its design based on a subtle combination of modernist, popular, and Mexicanist typographic elements. And thus he also became a key player of what was to be known as the mafia of Mexican letters. When the supplement's left-wing orientation clashed with the owners of the Novedades newspaper in 1961, Benítez and his team migrated to the weekly Siempre, where they relaunched the supplement with a dialectical pun. México en la Cultura became La Cultura en México, Culture in Mexico, a tabloid dominated by photographic compositions in black and white, many of them coming from the most important documentary photographers of the era, Nacho López and Héctor García. Whereas the heading of México en la Cultura emphasized a dialogue with handcraft, La Cultura en México was influenced by the aesthetic of illustrated magazines that combined well with the emergence of pop art and happenings and the news on the French and European new wave of cinema, along with the philosophical battles between people like Lévi-Strauss, McLuhan, and Roland Barthes. No doubt, Benítez was an excellent talent spotter. He recruited two of the most intelligent writers of the time, poet José Emilio Pacheco and master chronicler Carlos Monsiváis, as co-editors. And since Benítez frequently traveled to the most remote corners of the country, preparing a monumental study on Mexican Indian communities, the young team of Pacheco, Monsiváis, and Rojo were in charge of Mexican culture, defining the diet of intelligence for the country. Rojo, on his own, was the author of many of the most celebrated and memorable book covers of this time, including collaborators with the main public-funded publishing house, Fondo de Cultura Económica, as well with the most advanced literary publisher of the modern period, Enrique Díez-Canedo, at the Joaquín Mortiz House. Rojo was particularly talented interpreting fiction and poetry, in great part because he was a perceptive and avid reader of his contemporaries. Covers for El Volador series that you're seeing now have become integral to the classics of Mexican modern literature, like Juan José Arreola's La Feria from 1963 or Elizondo's Farabeuf from 1965. By far, however, Rojo's most famous cover, if not design, accompanies the most important book written in Spanish language in the 20th century, Gabriel García Márquez, 100 Years of Solitude from 1967. It is said that García Márquez, who had been published by Rojo in the early 60s, felt guilty for not offering his masterwork to Rojo's publishing house, Ediciones Era. So he insisted in forcing Sudamericana in Buenos Aires to include a cover by Vicente Rojo. Rojo found a way to combine old-fashioned typographies to convey the mixture popular elements and the complex construction of Garcia Marquez's book. Most visibly, he expressed the underlying madness of the family chronicle by Garcia Marquez by inverting the E of the word soledad in the title. Famously, a bookseller in Guayaquil, Ecuador, returned the edition to the publisher, claiming that the inverted E was a typographic mistake. All in all, Rojo's cover has become one of the landmarks of book design in the modern period in Latin America, in part for giving expression to the ambition of making the region's hybridism a mark of universal significance. His mastery in creating attractive covers for his books was intimately related to the change of cultural markets in the 1960s. A new sophisticated readership emerged, connected with the growth of university graduates that, very much like in other geographies, started to navigate the written world on the basis of the visual impact of design. Rojo's covers document a moment when high cultural values of discrete elegance were replaced by the need of speaking in a crowded environment of social science and consumption. Books and magazines became part of a new public sphere that was both radical and consumerist. This is the world that cultural agents like Vicente Rojo helped to construct as a new experience of modernity in the South. His contribution in shaping the thought and spirit of the radical 60s in Spanish language grows in importance in relation to his participation in the most influential independent publishing house of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Ediciones Era. Of course, Era means epoch in Spanish, but at the same time is the acronym of the three young associates of Imprenta Madero, the Espresate family, the printer José Azorín, and Vicente Rojo. In 1959, Rojo convinced his colleagues to start producing poetry and new literature to take advantage of the downtime of the printing machines of Imprenta Madero. It is remarkable that Vicente Rojo described the early collections of the company, Alacena, Copboard for literature, and Biblioteca Era, Era Library, as veritable laboratories of culture. They mixed well-established authors, such as Alfonso Reyes, Max Au, Cobo Abe, or José Lezama Lima, and Salvador Novo, with the emergent representatives of a new attitude, Carlos Fuentes, Sergio Pitol, Juan García Ponce, Elena Poniatowska, etc. After years of publishing the avant-garde, Era was on the brink of bankruptcy when in 1965, Neus Espresate, the daughter of Don Tomás, obtained the rights to publish Raúl Ortiz's translation of Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. Under the Volcano's unexpected commercial success did not only rescue Era from its financial disaster, it pushed the rest of the collections to establish the publisher as the basic source of the culture of new leftism and modernist culture in the country. Rojo used Ediciones Era as a visual manifest of a different idea of design in the 1960s, based on collage elements, high contrast photography, pure color layers, and a post-surrealist sense of humor. One has to assume also that Vicente Rojo was entirely responsible of the selection of titles of the main collection of the publishing house, the Serie Mayor, the Era, that, as historian Marina Garone said, quote, have endured in the design imaginary because they constitute an up-to-date model of image treatment and typography with respect to what was known in Mexico at the time, end of quote. Vicente Rojo selected, commissioned, and sometimes secretly co-authored their contents. Without Vicente's impulse, Fernando Benítez would probably have never turned his reportage on Mexican Indias into the 5-volume set that remains a major reference both of ethnological writing and anthropological photography. Those were books that had no use for academic conventions. Young readers discovered through Benítez that the magical worlds that Marina Sabina's use of mushrooms in shamanic therapies gave access, as well to the customs around peyote consumption amongst the Tarahumaras that already Antonin Artaud had written about in the 1930s. Also brought into circulation in Spanish language Paul Klee's diaries that had had an enduring influence in the ideologies of the artistic circles. And Paul Westheim's groundbreaking studies on pre-Columbian art, written from a German expressionist sensibility. From the mid-1960s, Imprenta Madero also started to print yearly booklets that were out of trade to reward its patrons and associates and promote the advanced technical capabilities of the company. Those small runs usually rely on a combination of layers of image and text, including the first very edition in Spanish of Walter Benjamin's essay on Paris, capital of the 19th century, and the elusive dictionary of ideas by Massimo Bontempelli, some of the most coveted and rare books in the antiquarian market. The most significant of those editions is probably Carlos Monsiváis's popist essay, ironically titled Principados y Potestades, Principalities and Powers, 1969, decorated with a green high contrast cover with the image of John Lennon, whose famous round glasses provide the basis for the organization of the title and name of the author on the cover. This experimental booklet was the blueprint of one of the most influential books of the last third of the 20th century, Carlos Monsiváis' Días de Guardar, Sabbath Days, that left the glossary of the 1960s sexual and cultural revolutions for posterity, along with one of the most impassioned chronicles of the repression of the 1968 movement. Not by chance, Rojo also published Carlos Fuentes' account of the French May in June 1968, in time to influence the Mexican movement that autumn. Central subversive ideas by authors like Che Guevara, Ernst Mandel, Eduardo Galeano, Regis Debray, or José Revueltas also circulated in Spanish in editions designed by Rojo for Era. Book as Adventure collaborations with Octavio Paz. Notwithstanding, the most significant books that Vicente Rojo published in the Era Publishing House are his two major collaborations with the most important Mexican writer of all times, probably, Octavio Paz. One, Marcel Duchamp, Libro Maleta, Marcel Duchamp Valise book, and the Discos Visuales, visual discs, both of them published on the fateful year of 1968. In the spring of 1967, Vicente Rojo learned that Paz was preparing a study of Duchamp in a preview that was available for publication in the Revista Bellas Artes. Writing to the poet by mail, Paz was then serving as Mexico's ambassador to India. Rojo's project expanded into a multiple editorial project that included two separate volumes, one for Paz study and an anthology of Duchamp's text translated by Tomás Segovia, the first time Duchamp was available in Spanish, as well as assorted facsimiles of Duchamp's work. The typographical problem, as they named it in the letters between poet and artist, posed by the project, was considerable. Rojo ended resolving it by imagining an object, quote, put together like a valise book in the manner of MD, end of quote, placed inside a box with a cover in the form of a chessboard. Paz couldn't felt himself better served, responding to the painter by mail, quote, Duchamp will be quite pleased, end of quote. Unluckily, Duchamp passed just the same month the book came to be printed. On his own merit, Marcel Duchamp's Libro Maleta has become exemplary of Vicente Rojo's collaborative practice and of his conception of the printed work as something more than an optical device. That is, as a typographic object designed as a spatial volume, open to be unfolded and handled by the user. The guidance that he took from Duchamp's La Boîte Verte, having been able to consult a copy in painter Rufino Tamayo's personal library, sharpened his passion for detail in the project, which proved quite consonant with the object-oriented perfection of Duchamp's creations. While the valise book was gestating, Paz was also working on broadening his poetry beyond the conventional space of the printed page. For instance, he imagined producing a cinematic version of his poem Blanco, hoping to enroll filmmaker José Luis Ibáñez to project abstract forms and colors on the screens mixed with fragments of the text. In that sense, in March '68, he proposed Vicente Rojo to introduce a kinetic dimension to the model of concrete poetry in order, quote, so that in order to read it, quote, the reader must put in motion a very simple object, a veritable toy, end of quote. Basing his concept of a promotional object from the airline TWA, Paz had conceived creating visual discs that would make it possible to create an album consisting on transformable poems. Rojo had made nearly 20 spade-shaped models of those discs, characteristically seeking out of design that would lose weight and importance so that the object toy character would be foregrounded. Function and freedom, the dialectic of design and painting. Rojo's early goal, as we have said, was to become a painter. Since early age, he was more interested in the practice of the studio than any of the social or political implications of the role of the painter, which in Mexico were particularly important because of the inheritance of Mexican muralism. In the early 1960s, Rojo switched his interest to abstraction, first working in almost monochromatic fashion to later establish a methodology that we could describe as structuralist. His breakthrough took place in the midst of 1964, when he took a sabbatical year in Barcelona to devote all his time to paint and visited the American Pavilion in the Venice Biennial. He was transfixed by the way Jasper Jones explored the possibilities of a new art based on a constant self-critique that seemed to destroy the conventional social and cultural signs. Starting with the series Senialis Signals, 1966-1972, Rojo subjected himself to a self-imposed discipline that consisted in working simultaneously on a set of works, sometimes more than 10 or 15 at a time, which shared an underlying design that was to be outstripped and reshaped by the painting itself in a constant dialectic between the shared norm and unplanned differentiation, arising from the labor of painting itself. This simultaneous development of, quote, putting together a puzzle and at the end of which each piece would have a unitary value with the set and with the whole, and at the same time, a unique autonomous value on its own, quote, was a self-critique of authorship and a way to assume the labor of painting more than any ideology of art. That distance deepened his decisions that led him to undertake the series Negaciones in the mid-1970s, negations, denials, that was conceived entirely as an attempt to reject the ego from the painting. Each painting was based in the same geometric element, but had to deny the previous one, depersonalizing the work. Without diverting from this serial methodology, in the second part of the 1970s, Rojo turned to produce series that reworked an underlying image coming from memories. In the 1980s, for instance, he produced his most popular set, México bajo la lluvia, Mexico under rain, consisting of overall quasi-op art compositions made of colorful diagonals crossing canvases in square format. Those refer to his astonishment in the 1960s from witnessing several rain curtains in the landscape of the Valley of Puebla. From that moment onwards, Rojo's painting combined an interest in the process of destruction and construction in the studio with the abstracted reference to elements in landscape and his memory, scenarios or scenes from 1989 to 2007, to finally derive in a work that lasted a decade and a half that meditated on the concept of writing, the series Escrituras, Writings from 2006 to 2020. In Vicente Rojo's case, how did the job of graphic designer related to his adventure as an abstract painter? For many years, in the few interviews that he reluctantly granted, Rojo argued the need of keeping those tasks as distant as possible. He opposed the functional roles of design as a servant of culture to the utopia of painting as a refuge for opacity and individual freedom. And I'm going to quote here Rojo from an interview in the early 70s. Quote, "Through the painting that I plan to do or that I do end up doing, I can't in any way come to meet needs of a social or communication type. With each passing day, my painting gets more closed off, more difficult, and I hope it continues to do so. I realize that it is outside the world, outside of the social duties that every man must have with respect to his peers. So the opportunity that I had to do typographical work, first and editorial work after that, gave me that responsibility of communicating or of extending my artistic activity. There are two paths which, although key in running parallel to each other, actually go in opposite directions. I project the editorial part outside of myself, while the pictorial part increasingly turns inward." End of quote. Those assertions, of course, were not only an affirmation of modernist imported values, they were politically decisive at a time when artists, and especially leftists, were confronted by the epigons of Mexican mural painting that generalized the assumption that art had to be at the service of politics. Rojo's case involves still the pursuit of autonomy and the separation of different fields of practice related to the hope of fulfilling an agenda of emancipation as a defense of culture as a goal on its own. However, precisely because Rojo's work inhabited such separation of design and painting that was even reflected in his workday, he would arrive very early to Imprenta Madero at the beginning of the day to be able to devote the late afternoon and evening to paint in his studio at home. There are several moments in which work thematized the separation and connection of those tasks. In 1968, for instance, what a year, 68, by the way, Vicente Rojo constructed a hybrid object that subverted the logic of his pure paintings. Artifact consisted of a commercial display rack of paperback books, which the artist appropriated in order to substitute printed volumes with paintings that could only be picked up and fondled, tempting the spectator reader to take them in their hands to contemplate their tactility. The work pointed to a genus of conceptual operations that explored also the aesthetic experiences of an emergent consumerist behavior. Many artist books made after 1970 in collaboration with writers like poets José Emilio Pacheco and José Miguel Ullán kept exploring that interstice between the space of contemplation of the object and the involvement of the reader. In any case, after Rojo suffered a heart attack in the late 1990s, he was forced to choose between his craft and his art and abandoned Imprenta Madero, and for the first time, he became a full-time artist. As if reflecting on such a change, Rojo's painting entered a phase of synthesis. The different works of Escritura's writings in the beginning of the 21st century kept on interrogating the qualities of the space of the text and the architecture of the written sign. In fact, the title of the series showed in his last museum exhibition in 2014 could be an allegory of his life work. Casa de Letras, House of Letters. Indeed, Rojo was an architect of our cultural and intellectual habitat. And in his late years, he indeed found that art and graphic design were encompassed by a single impulse, quote, "In my view, both practices coalesce in the task I am truly interested about. Above all, I consider myself a worker of, about, and for culture. I choose to interpret it in a rather simple or complicated form. To work for culture is to work for life," end of quote. His extraordinary productivity was a testimony of a secular faith that maybe we have buried too early under the rubble of our confusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Cuauhtémoc. And I noticed that now the construction began, that you said. We heard some thumping there. And I'm going to open up questions to the floor. But I actually wanted to ask you something very specific. And knowing the years of a high production of Vicente Rojo and the importance that he had within the established institutions, however left they were at the time, but that had the power. How is it that Vicente Rojo, during his times in the 1960s of most well-known productions and collaborations, was not invited to do the Mexico Olympics logo and identities?
That's interesting because I never thought on that. First of all, the Olympics were a direct continuity of the projects that architect Ramirez Vázquez made in the mid-60s, namely the Anthropology Museum and the Museum of Modern Art. And he was very keen on hiring young collaborators to make basically his work. He was more of an architect director than a proper designer. Therefore, he was very used to have teams and to privatize his service to the government, to the point that Ramirez Vázquez's son not only claims that the design of the Olympics was his father's work, rather than that Lance Wyman's, but actually owns the copyright instead of the government. So there's a certain logic in which this was a juncture where private, were of a state project that was effectively privatized. Then, of course, the amount of work of the design office was enormous. And they were very, very right in hiring somebody to basically work around the clock in producing all that. So I presume that it was also important that there was an attempt to achieve a new phase in the identity of the project. And I think Lance Wyman brought an incredible understanding of what could be, again, the new phase of the aspirations of modernization that unluckily were caught by the violence of the regime precisely in relation to the student movement. I will finally say that I believe that Rojo, after 1960, was not any longer in the position of being hired as for an external office. He had his own kingdom, which was large enough. And anyway, it's interesting that a lot of the printed matter of the Olympics was produced at Imprenta Madero.
Okay, so he was a producer of it, but not the designer. And I think that one of the things that is also interesting is the development of him from being a 70-year-old assistant to becoming immediately the director of the entire design and communication wing of INBA. And during this, of the National Institute of Fine Arts. And during this time, he develops en par with the work of Fernando Gamboa, who is the director of the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico, and among many other duties. And he's also known to have been a designer, Fernando Gamboa, a designer of his own materials within the museum and within the production, which is something that is at least quite similar here to a number of the people that have worked at institutions historically, that they were not only the designers of a program, but the designers of the exhibition, the design, graphics, communication, posters, and all media. Can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between Vicente Rojo and Fernando Gamboa in just a little bit more depth so that we understand how these two important figures of imagery in modern Mexico's graphic design and spatial design within exhibitions and museums developed?
Well, as I explained, Gamboa is the person that understood that the Fine Arts Institute had to have an identity. So he was very busy in using design to produce institutions earlier, probably, than anybody in the cultural sector. Mm-hmm. So it's quite logical that that was a trademark of his production. But he was a graphic artist in the beginning. He actually studied as a engraver with the people of the Popular Graphics Workshop in the 1930s. Now, I understand that Gamboa and Rojo were quite close and they respected each other. And Rojo somehow belongs to the generation that never put Gamboa's construction of the canon into question, actually helped to effect it. And as you heard, Monsiváis has that very interesting moment when he basically compares Rojo with Gamboa in relation to what they produced, precisely the production of the canon. Now, my impression is that by the late 60s and early 70s, the position of Rojo has become complicated in relation to the way painters, particularly between 1966 and 1968, defied the institutions. The most important part of that was that during the student movement in 1968, most advanced painters, including Rojo, decided not to collaborate with the Olympic cultural program, to reject the salon that was being organized around the Olympics, so as to constitute an independent salon that for 3 years practically involved a strike of contemporary visual artists in relation to the institutions. So Gamboa was in a complicated position because he was at the same time trying to bridge that gap, and effectively the policies of the Museum of Modern Art played with that problem. For instance, these artists withdrew the works they had loaned to the Museum of Modern Art in protest of the violence of the state in '68. Gamboa then went to buy a lot of artworks because one single opportunity he had money to actually stuff the museum. And but later on, my impression is that Rojo's leftism probably was not terribly aligned with Gamboa's conservatism. I showed the cover of the Artis Visuales issue that was devoted to conceptual art, and it's extraordinary that the cover is a rejection of Rojo's role as designer, that he invites the audience to produce the design in very much in line with the type of critique that young artists were doing of the museum space.
Yeah, I think that it's quite interesting. I want to see if there's any questions from the audience, otherwise I can continue asking many questions. Are there any questions that you would like to ask Cuauhtémoc about Vicente Rojo or graphic design in Mexico in general? I'm going to raise another question that relates to just the academic, or if not the educational background, in terms of when you speak right now of that relationship between Gamboa and Vicente Rojo. You mentioned that Gamboa was actually trained as a engraver, in the school of graphic arts in Mexico, which, if you really understand, in the 1930s, the graphic arts of Mexico are something completely different from we would understand graphic arts or graphic design here in Europe being developed in a just completely different way in terms of typography and organization. And in Mexico, as it pertains a kind of a revival of the craft and the illustration that comes about other histories that are far from the modernist histories of the European canon in terms of sans serifs, columns, grids, and such. So I just wanted to get a sense of how, and it's not until much later that graphic design schools, ultimately, as we know them today, were formed there. So Vicente Rojo comes from an interest in painting as an illustrator, and in painting as an artist. He develops his own language in painting. Gamboa has come from a kind of academic background as a graphic illustrator more than anything. And where is and how is it that happens the graphic design as we know it in terms of academic upbringing, circles of graphic designers beyond the emporium of Vicente Rojo? And I know that this is something that you have researched for your publication, or for a number of publications, and even in an early exhibition of graphic design in Mexico that you did at Carrillo Gil. So can you just speak a little bit about graphic design as we know it in terms of the formative arts and its separation with the illustration or graphic nature of what is now known as more crafty versions of design?
It's a very interesting issue because Rojo was very self-conscious of being a hinge between two kinds of practice. Even though he was trained solely by Miguel Prieto, as I explained, he became very aware of the importance of typographic and graphic experimentation in Mexico in the early part of the 20th century. And the exhibition that you're mentioning, that was actually titled Design Before Design, because it referred to the fact that there was no professional definition of designer in the first half of the century or before Rojo, was in fact something that Vicente Rojo advised me to do. I met him because of that exhibition, and he guided me through that, through curating that show. I was very young. And so it was mostly painters and graphic artists. Gabriel Fernández Ledesma, Francisco Díaz de León, the most important, who were aware of the history of typography in the world and Europe, but they learned it by looking at books, and they invented a new set of Mexicanist codes, and also they started to train people in art schools. Now, the Spanish Republic exile also brought to Mexico Joseph Renau, who made the most important cinema posters of the period. But it's interesting that Rojo never contributed to the new graphic design schools that started to appear in the National University and other places in the 1960s. He trained a good number of very important graphic designers in the print shop, in Imprenta Madero publishing house. Again, as a matter of transmission, some of them are really important. Rafael López Castro, Azul Morris, Germán Montalvo. So, and in turn is Rojo's students who actually started to teach. So there is something about the way in which he served the university, but he never was part of the logic of academic training. Historian Marina Garone is right in saying that this lack of participation in the process of formal education somehow sets Rojo's case apart from the logic of that time in other places. Again, my impression is that he was so busy. It's amazing to see how many things he did. I need to tell you that one of my earliest experiences with him, because of that exhibition, was waiting to talk to him in Imprenta Madero. And I saw him doing something that I still cannot believe. He got a manuscript, and in the early 90s, manuscripts were bunches of paper with lots of added glued pages with tape and a lot of handwritten changes. And he just browsed it like this and turned it to the technician and said, it's going to be so many characters in this type, and it's going to be like 8 pages. But it was a matter of pure experience. I mean, my impression is that what was remarkable is that he could manage to keep a certain imagination in relation to the speed of his process. But above all, he was somebody that was learning or stealing ideas from looking at other people's work. Artis de Mexico, for instance, he created a lot of the ideas of that magazine with his impression of looking at the Swiss magazine Du. And my feeling is that the fact that for the first time you could actually import books was a key element in the development of this local designing culture.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, and I will just say, mention here as of an anecdote is that just to close up, is that I did a studio visit with him when I was living in Mexico at the time, when I was directing the Museo Tamayo, with an interest of doing an exhibition with him or something. And when I went to visit him, this is over a decade ago, I said, I arrived to his studio in Coyoacan, and he was working on a circus of sorts. And I'm like, where's all the graphic work? And he said, what do you mean? I'm like, where are all your books, all the things you've designed? He's like, I don't have any of that. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'm coming here to see where's the material of all these things that he's done. He's like, no, but I couldn't keep them all. There's so many. They're out there in the world. And I left there that studio saying, like, he doesn't have anything except a miniature circus world that he was building. And I was unaware. He told me at that time that he had a heart attack, and he had decided either graphic design or painter. And he's like, graphic design, ciao. It's too much stress. There's too much, the deadlines of this, like his overproduction was clearly there. But my question to you is, how was a compilation of all this body of work, of graphic work, that you gathered of him, whether in books and titles and so on? How did you actually get it? And maybe he lied to me and he had everything in an archive down, but he really didn't have anything, eh?
He didn't technically lie to you. Gallerist
Possibly.
Gallerist Lopez Quiroga managed to convince him to give him all the remains of the archive, so he has them, and he has been completing a collection of design.
So who is the gallery? Who's the gallery?
Ramon Lopez Quiroga. Besides that,
so someone had a right before, you mean?
Yeah, but he was a very close friend of Vicente. Yeah. Besides that, we borrowed a lot of things from his library, but also everybody's libraries. Rojo's library and the remains of his archive are going to be donated by his family to the University Museum of Contemporary Art, to our archive collection. But the truth of the matter is that he indeed didn't like to keep paper. Yeah. He had a tendency to recycle, and he was at least able to keep materials from Prieto, which was difficult to preserve out of love. But in reality, exhibitions and books that have been made of Vicente have relied a lot in people having preserved these materials at home. Look, I mean, I'm the happy owner of these. I keep on looking for materials in secondhand bookshops. Of course, now people recognize what is from Rojo and is becoming a major focus of collecting. But at the end of the day, the idea that this was a process that provoked a democratization of culture is very real. The materials are now somehow, because of the death of a generation, coming back into the book market. What is really almost impossible to find is the Madero print shop little books. Those are really hard to get. I mean, you need to be going to the flea market every week to once in every 5 years find one. But again, the whole culture of Mexico, and because of the influence of Mexican printing, publishing industry around the Latin American and Spanish speaking world, all around the continent as well, is plagued by the works by Rojo.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for that explanation. I think that flea markets are something that many of us do here. If there are no more questions at all, no? So we close the keynote. Cuauhtémoc, thank you so very much for your presentation.
On the contrary, I need
very
to say
insightful.
Again, it was important to me to give this talk because Vicente was a very close friend, and it was really significant for me to have to speak about him just a few months after his passing.
Okay. Well, thank you. And we leave you at that with that memory, good memory of him. And I see you all after a brief coffee break so that we can turn the hand now to Yingying Wong for our next panel. So we'll be meeting here in 15 minutes. No? Thank you. Gracias.